Hello and welcome to another advanced deep dive. So this time round we're going to be revisiting a previous project and adding a little bit to it. So we're taking a look at the procedural generation, which if you remember we previously set up so we had generation of biomes and applying textures and generating features and areas like that we were applying to it. So what I want to actually look at today is two sort of more advanced things there, where we're placing buildings and where we're making the terrain conform a little bit to what we're after with that, and then another one being where we're able to be kind of stamping down features. And so we're going to dive in and take a look at that. So let's take a look at what I've got set up. Firstly, looking at the feature side of things for textures. So I've set up this texture, which the texture blends from black to white and intentionally sort of fades out at the edges. The idea being that where this texture is fully black, that is going to use the existing terrain height, and where it is fully white, it will be using whatever the new terrain height that it's set for that feature. And then in between it will blend. There's a similar approach being used for the buildings, where this underlay will control how it blends between the existing terrain height and a flattened height for where that building gets placed. So let's have a look at then how we can set this up. So if we remember with what we had, we've got things like our height modifiers. Now for the features, that actually is able to be just the main thing that we just change the height for it. The buildings is going to require a little bit extra beyond that, but we'll be able to, for the actual features, just stamp that in as the height modifier, and then we let the normal processing of the texturing, blending, all of that apply in here. So our Heightmap modifiers, I'm going to create a new Heightmap modifier. And this is going to be a Heightmap modifier for features. And the building one will end up actually being quite similar to this. The main difference with the building one is that we kind of have a couple of stages to it potentially, because we've got to adjust the terrain height, but then we also have to spawn the building. So in terms of with the Heightmap modifier, I'm going to grab largely the content of the smoothing one. And the reason for that is the smoothing one is pretty close to what we already need to do with our features one. The main difference is that the features one had a set size, and over that size it would average out the content there. Whereas what we're wanting to do in this case is we're wanting to blend to a particular height. So what I'm going to do is, because the smooth type one, I want to do a couple of different things. I do want this looping over everything. I don't want it storing the smooth types, because I actually want to get the average height, and then I'm going to work out a height offset above that. So starting point. So Heightmap modifier smooth, my new one can be a per biome one. And I'll get rid of smoothing kernel size. So I'm following an approach I like to follow here of intentionally breaking the code so that I identify the areas that I need to fix. Because I want to get the average height out of this, which I'm going to set to 0, and num height samples, which I'll also set to 0. And what I can do is these parts here I want to grab out. So sum the Heightmap values. Before we were averaging over a particular range, so it was just over a small range that we were doing that averaging over, whereas in this case I want to average over a much larger area. Now at the moment this would average over the entire map, which is not what we will want to do. But this gets us closer to what we're after. So in this case then, average height divided by the num height samples. Cool. So this would average the entire map, but we actually want this to be picking a particular location and averaging it over that spot. So I need to set up a definition for my features. So this is going to be something that I can serialize. Public class feature config. So the features are going to be defined by a texture. So we're going to have a texture 2D, and this is going to be the height map for that feature. Then we're going to be able to control the height of it, and we're going to be able to control the radius of it, or the dimension. So with this, I think I would go for radius. I think makes sense in terms of how it's being applied. So then our feature modifier here is going to, the other thing we might want to have is number of ones to spawn. Num to spawn, which might just set it as 1 for now. And then we'll have our configuration of those. So a list of feature configs. And then what we end up doing here is we don't want to loop over the entire map. What we want to do is we want to pick a location, and then we want to traverse the area around that. So what I'm going to do is split this up a little bit. So traverse the features. So for each feature in features. And then I want to pick a location to spawn in. So spawn X. So if we think about this, I don't want to spawn too close to the edge of the map. So I would be inclined to say that it's a random range between the feature's radius and map resolution minus feature radius. That way the feature is always able to be fully contained within the map. And then that looks pretty good, but that would currently be giving us a float. So I'm just going to cast that to an integer. And then spawn y is going to be exactly the same process. So we've picked a spawn location. So what I would then do is, okay, well, spawn feature, and we give it the spawn X and spawn Y. We know we're going to need to provide map resolution and height map. We may end up needing height map scale, so I might chuck that in as well, just for completeness. So now we can set up our spawn feature function. So that, I'm going to actually put that up here. Above that execute function. So I'll set this up here. I'll make it protected. And so spawn feature. So I know the first thing it's going to take in is a feature config. I know it's going to take in a spawn X and a spawn Y. And then I know my key other settings that I need here in terms of the map resolution, height map scale, things like that. So that looks pretty good. And what I would be able to do then is I would be able to bring most of this logic here over into that. So the idea being we just have a generic thing for doing the spawning of feature, because this will also have a lot of similar code to what we can use when we are working with the buildings, for example. So in this case, I want to loop from Y through to feature radius, and actually I'm going to make this goes from minus feature radius So it fully covers that range. So minus feature.radius to feature radius, which that is going to, I might actually change the feature radius here to an int. I think makes sense to have that as an integer actually, which would mean then picking of the random ones here, we can have that as an integer. I think the feature radius, the sizes of ones, we're not really spawning things that are going to be fractions of a meter. Okay, we're looping like that. We'll do the same thing with x, feature radius, less than or equal to feature.radius, because then our location here, we actually add in spawn x plus spawn y. So what we're doing, sum the height values under the feature, calculate the average height, and then we work out our target height. So the target height is going to be the average height plus, so target height is our average height plus whatever the height scale is for the feature. So the height. Now we have a target height. So then we're looping through our height map, and we can actually use, again, similar process to here. Now with this, previously we were blending, and what I will do here is I might actually say int working x is equal to x plus spawn x. That'll just shorten the code a little bit in the other areas and save us having to constantly be doing the calculation. So working y is equal to ry plus the spawn y. And that then can feed in, whoops, that should have been working. Yeah. So this can then feed in here where these become working x and working y. This becomes our height maps, working x, working y. And then we have our target y. So our target height. And then we have this strength. Now, the strength, in this case, has to come from that texture. Because if you remember, the feature has a particular texture assigned to it, and we want to read the pixels from this texture. So we can do that. There's an important thing we need to remember for being able to do that, though. And if we go and take a look at the actual data for it, so if we take a look at the features, we want to be able to read from this texture. So we need to actually come in here, and you'll see under advanced, there's read write enabled. So we want to make sure that's ticked and to apply. That will allow us to actually read our texture. So here, apply the feature. So what we're going to be able to do here is we need to sample that. So for sampling the texture, we've actually got a few different ways of being able to do that. So we have get pixel. Now we could provide an x and y coordinate. We actually have other options for being able to do this. And if we take a look, we also have get pixel by linear. And this one is really handy because this one, we can give it UV coordinates. And in particular, UV coordinates that are in a 0 to 1 range, which we can very easily convert our x and y to a 0 to 1 range. So we're going to use that get pixel by linear. And what we're going to do is texture y is going to be equal to y minus feature.radius, and I'm going to explicitly cast that to a float, divided by, and then actually that won't be an int, that will be a float. So y minus feature radius divided by feature.radius times by 2f, We need to make sure where this calculation is happening with floats, because if we don't, what will happen is we're dividing a number by something that's going to be larger, and being integers, that will just go to 0. Really easy to run into, so we want to just avoid that. And I'm just going to clamp that. So that's our textures Y. Then we can have our textures X. Again, really straightforward. So then for getting the bilinear one, we provide our texture X, texture Y, and that gives us out a color. So that gives us the pixel color. So we're sampling the Heightmap here. Now, Heightmap, we've made it grayscale, because what that lets us do is, well, okay, pixel color, and we can use any of the particular ones. So float strength is equal to this. So that will sample the texture, and it will use that for working out how it blends the particular height, which is great. So we've got our target height, all of that set up. Here for spawning the feature here, we also can do this where for int feature index is equal to 0, feature index is less than feature num to spawn, just we're making sure we're spawning all of the particular ones that we might need. Got this. Okay, so we can set this up. We can configure this on something now and see how that actually works. So what we're going to do is if we take a look at the various, we've got the various height modifier, prefabs and so forth here, and we've also got specific ones for the different biomes. We also have the ability for doing sort of the post-processing one. So I'm actually going to put the features, because I could have the features be per biome. In this case, I just want to have them appear anywhere. So I'm going to set this up, have our config for the feature. We could also be starting to configure things like probabilities of ones. So there is a lot of stuff we could be doing there in terms of controlling that sort of aspect. I want to make this feature fairly high. So I'm going to say 30. I'm going to say a radius of, let's go for initially, I think a radius of 25. And we'll tell it to pick 5. Now we're not doing anything to ensure the locations are clear. We could be setting up stuff for that. At the moment we're just focusing on, okay, is this going to work? Are we going to see the particular features in there? So let's select our ProcGen manager and tell it to regenerate the world. So it's going to obviously take a little bit because we do have quite a few things there in our world generation where it's spawning objects, stuff like that. What we're looking for is hopefully this will have spawned a bunch of these features. And you can take a look and see if we did get any. It is a little bit hard to tell with that if it did. So what we would actually probably want to do is anytime it's gone and chosen to spawn one, so debug log spawned feature at spawn x, spawn y, just so we have a really clear indicator so we know that it's actually spawned one. And then what we can also do is we can ramp up the setup for that. So that height modifier for the post-processing, what we can do is let's make the radius of this more like 50, and then let's make the height also more like 50. Now, that height, we also need to remember and do a conversion on it, because if we remember, these heights are going to be 0 to 1, whereas this would not be. So we need to go and check and see, okay, when we were doing offsetting of things, we have to divide by the Heightmap scale. So we're going to need to do the same thing here, where it's the feature height divided by Heightmap scale, because otherwise we would have been just swamping the height of things massively. Now it is going to go through smoothing, so smoothing will knock things down a little bit. But we want to test to make sure that this is actually generating stuff. So we'll regenerate the world, and once that's done, we should hopefully see in the console that it's spawned at least, that it has spawned one. We've got it only trying to spawn one, but we'll be able to see where it's actually spawned it. We could also, as a test, override and force it to spawn at a very specific location. So we can see it reckons that it has spawned ones. It's a little bit hard for us to tell if it actually has. We can't really sort of see there if there's particular ones that have happened. So what we could do, and it has spawned a few ones, which I think we did set it to spawn a few different ones. Yeah, so we did set it to spawn 5, and we did get 5 ones properly spawned. In terms of them being able to spot them, we have things that potentially could be. If we look at the locations, they all tend to be sort of grouped roughly around the middle of the map. We can't really see anything sort of overly obvious with it. So what we would do is we want to just make sure that it is actually properly calculating these things and applying it. And this could be a thing when you're layering these ones in, it can be hard to actually tell what stuff is running and what stuff isn't. So good to always be stepping through, testing the code, making sure the particular bits are running. So that's going to be thinking about it. Should break into the code. It's what we're expecting to see. So you can see average height. So it's got an average height of 0.02, which is good. And if we step over, the target height that it's going for is 0.1. So it's not really raising it a huge amount. The height of this feature relative to the height of sort of the entire environment is not actually that high, because it's quite a large terrain that we're stepping through there. And we can check and make sure that we're seeing valid sort of values here. So we would expect to see our texture X and texture Y be 0, which is correct, which we would then expect the strength for that to also be 0. Now, it's worth putting a breakpoint here, and we could set a condition where the strength is greater than 0, because that's something where we expect to see that that is happening. We want to just confirm. So we're not seeing any case of it hitting the breakpoint. So that potentially means that we might have some issues there where it isn't ever actually properly hitting it. Now with this, the X and Y, those are nicely in the middle. We should see a texture X and texture Y that aren't 0. So we are getting ones being 0 there. So if we take a look, we've got 19 minus that. So that's something where the smallest one actually should be minus of that. So we are doing the calculation there a little bit incorrectly, because our smallest value for the radius is actually minus of feature radius. So rather than doing minus here, we should be doing plus. So we do have some code issues that we've identified there. So that's okay, we can fix that. So it's minus of the minus, so we can do plus. Now that should then mean that at times we're getting values that are outside of that 0 to that are in that properly that 0 to 1 range. So that looks better. Because before what would have happened is we were actually artificially restricting the range, and so we would have also been introducing a lot of negative values there. The other thing that I will do is I will actually change that height, because as we saw, that height is not really particularly much. It was only increasing it by 0.08, which is quite a small amount given what the max height can be. So we are going to ramp this up to something that should definitely be visible. If it's successfully in reading that texture, it's going to be visible. And this is often a thing when you're testing stuff. If a particular value doesn't work, double it or multiply it by 10 or halve it or divide it by 10, and then that's usually going to be enough where it's actually fully visible at that point. The other thing we can do is, because that does take a little bit of time to run, we might be able to break in here and potentially catch a case where we can see the results. We can't, because it did complete, but the good thing is, if you look, it has generated these. Now, obviously, at the moment, that is a little bit too high. So we know immediately that we can drop the height of that down. I think let's go for more like 100. But the multiplying by 10 successfully worked to reveal that it was actually running. And the key thing is, it's blending in with that terrain. Like, yes, it's going quite ridiculous in height, but it is smoothly blending in with the terrain that's been generated around it, which is great. That's what we're after. So this should then mean, with a bit more of a reasonable height, we see these being stamped in, but they're being stamped in a way where it looks a lot more reasonable, which is obviously more what we're after with that. And there we go. We can see we've got these little mountains now being stamped in. And the cool thing with this is that means you could get Heightmap data for little features and be able to set up a bunch of ones and stamp them in. So it means you can get a blend of procedural generation plus also overlaying that with some very specific structures and scales of things, which is cool. And that's something where if you look at some tools like Gaia, that actually has stamps that you can apply that will do things like of that. So that's cool. We've got our Heightmap modifier going there with that. Now, the final one we want to do is for buildings. So I'm going to set this up. It'll be a fairly similar script actually to the features one. So I am going to duplicate the features one intentionally because buildings use a lot of the same data. So we're going to modify this. So this is our buildings one. So buildings, building config. This down here becomes building config. And again, following that approach of intentionally breaking things. So buildings, they do have a height map, but they don't have a height. What they do have is a game object, prefab. So spawn feature will become spawn building, because the first step with spawning a building is we need to smooth that terrain. And that's why I'm reusing a bunch of stuff from the feature one, because we already have largely that. We calculate an average height and we then raise that based on a texture that we've provided. In this case, I don't want to raise it, I just want to smooth the height in that location. So building. So again, under the building, so this is just going through and renaming things. Now, target height is just our average height. We don't want to apply any offset. We could, if we wanted to, but we don't actually need to. So apply the building height map. Going to set this up. So again, it's exact same process to the extent where we could actually set up some common code for this. And this is something where we've got enough of a setup now where we get a bit of a sense of what are areas that we would need to have as common code. So that looks pretty good. Traverse the buildings, building and buildings. So again, just go through and we update these. And I'm going to remove the debug lines because we don't really need those anymore. So this is spawn building. We do have our set of buildings that we're looping through. That looks pretty good. And I'll also rename this as well. Rename symbol, building index. That looks pretty good. Now buildings, I intentionally am going to have these, they run right at the very end. And there's a very particular reason for that, because afterwards we don't want any other things modifying the terrain. Placing of buildings is usually something that I'd want to do pretty much right at the very end. Now, same thing for buildings. If I go to that, I've also got a underlay texture. And again, I need to enable read write so that we can actually read from that texture. And then now I can just set that modifier up. So it's again in our post-processing. So this is going to be the buildings one. And I'm going to set up just a single building, which if we grab our data for it, we have our underlay. Now I'm using a very simple underlay here, but we could use much more complex setup for it. I need to provide a radius, and that radius needs to match with the scale size of the building. So the building that I've put in is just a couple of pillars, and those pillars, if we take a look, those side ones are about 5 meters away. So the actual total size of this, it's about 10 by 10 meters. So I would actually, with that, I want to allow a bit more space than just the 10 by 10 meters. So I wouldn't use 10 here. I would actually use a fair bit of a larger value, probably something like 30, so that there's a smooth transition happening there with it. And let's spawn 5 of these. And what I will also do is, so we've got everything there under the ProcGen manager. I will also do the actual instantiation of the building at this point. So this is where I need to convert from my coordinates here to the actual world space coordinates. So our object placer has already actually solved that problem, where we can see we've got our setup stuff where it can be getting candidate locations, and that gives back a vector 3. So if we go and take a look at that, you can see how we do the conversion, and we're just going to retrieve that. Again, that would be a good sort of helper function to actually set up so that we just have a common thing that we're able to use. So in this case, we would have vector 3 building location is a new vector 3 of, we use spawn y. We need to get the height at that location, so it'd be the height at spawn x, spawn y. And we have the final coordinate, which is our spawn x. Then it's just a matter of instantiating the building. So it's just instantiating the prefab, just as we have done with many other things. So building prefab, we give it the building location, and we're just going to use identity, but we could allow for rotations to be happening there. It would absolutely be something that we could support. We also could then be locating our ProcGen manager. Don't think we've made ProcGen manager a instance or static, so we don't have a quick method for retrieving it. But we'll get this spawning first, then we can do a little bit of cleanup. So spawn the building. That looks good. So let's check and see. What we should expect is to see 5 buildings spawned, random locations in the world, and that those buildings are reasonably aligned with the terrain. There might be a little bit of tweaking that we need to do, but we should expect them to be pretty well aligned with the terrain. So our ProcGen manager, let's tell it to regenerate the world. And again, one of the advantages of having this, that go through the Heightmap stage of things, is that means that the textures, things like of that, are all going to be appropriate based upon the slope. There's a consistency there. That happens with our features, happens with the underlays for the buildings. We could also have a setup where we could manually stamp in textures in locations associated with these too. That would be absolutely a doable thing also. And if we were having some very sophisticated things we're planning, we might want to do that to paint in things like roads or stuff like of that. But with this, we've got a few buildings, so let's take a look. So we can see it's largely conformed to the terrain. We do get a little bit of it going into it. That's because that smoothing radius is a blended circle. So it's not a uniform perfect height throughout the entire section. So we will still get a little bit of offsetting. The center one is generally going to be pretty good, but it's going to be able to be offset a bit there. So that's something where we could be tweaking the texture. So if we take a look at our texture, the moment we see that there is a consistent blend throughout there. So we could be changing that so it actually is very, very intense in the center. So it's fully exactly the height we need, and then it spans further out. We could also change the range that it's actually doing this, generate this over. So rather than it being 30, if we ramp that up to say 50, that's going to have a wider spread there. And then in terms of being able to fix up where the things spawn, let's do that as a consistent thing as well. So for with the buildings, what I'm going to do is find object of type, procgen manager, and that is going to be what we spawn the buildings under. So this is going to be finding that, building root is equal to that and its transform, which is good. So I can pass that transform in, and I'll pass that in as the last thing. So then here we have our transform building root. And then if we get down here to our spawning, then all we need to do is provide building root. Now we do need to make sure that any of those things that have been spawned also get cleared out. Now at the moment, anything that's under our procgen manager gets cleared away. So if we bring our buildings under, what we should expect to see, unless we need to make a modification to the code, is that when we regenerate the world, these existing buildings get cleared away, and then we only have still 5 buildings. So we'll check this, we'll run it, and then we'll see if we need to actually update and make some tweaks there to how it's clearing the things away. We might need to, but we also might not need to. It will depend upon whether in the previous setup we put in, we were a lot more specific with, a lot more careful with how we was actually cleaning things up. So this is going to be running. While that's running, I'm also going to clear out this code here. I won't save it just yet, because I don't want to interrupt the process that's happening there. So, got everything spawned. Our building did get cleared away, which is good. And if we take a look, we can just do, probably the easiest thing to do is search for building. So we can't actually see our buildings. So let's take a look and see what's potentially happened there. So what it might be is, depending upon where that cleanup pass happens for the objects, what could be happening is that that cleanup happens after the buildings get spawned. And as we can see, perform object placement, which runs after the Heightmap stuff, clears out the particular ones. So what we will need to do is, the object placement itself is fine. it just needs to be brought earlier. So we can find where this is being run from. It's being run here. So what we would do is regenerate the world, clear out the previously spawned objects there. So we did need to make some changes to it, which is not surprising because it's a new feature and functionality we're adding in, but they're not major changes that we needed to make to it. So now we'll regenerate the world again. We should expect to see now we actually do get the buildings in there and they do remain in there, which is what we're after with this. And this is something where, these sort of additions, you could then be doing further stuff where this is looking at biomes and where it's spawning buildings keyed to particular biomes. You could also start to be sharing data, so you could pick the location to spawn at an earlier stage and then cache that data, keep that data around to be using it later for doing spawning, and spawn objects near or around the buildings. You could create connections between them. So like at the texturing stage could see, okay, well there's a couple of buildings here, let's draw out some roads in between them. So we've now got our stuff spawned and we can see we do have some buildings that are spawned. They're with that larger radius, they're a little bit more on the terrain, which is great. And so that is looking pretty good. So the key things we're needing to do with this is we set up our Heightmap modifier for the features. And so we're using textures to be guiding the shape of the terrain here, and in particular guiding how we blend between the current terrain height and the terrain height we've calculated. And the process for stamping down a feature is very similar to buildings, and feature one allows us to, we could be grabbing Heightmap data from anything. We could be painting textures in Photoshop or similar programs. We could be downloading, segments of terrain from areas and stamping that in. We can use a similar process with the buildings. The main difference is we're actually applying on top of that then some prefabs. So it gives us a really cool way of being able to enhance the project and get things looking really cool. So as always, the code for this project is fully available up on GitHub. You are freely able to use the code, any of the assets I've created in this project for any of your own projects, whether those are commercial or non-commercial ones, entirely able to be used there. If you've got any questions, chuck in a comment below, happy to help out. If you've found the stuff helpful and used it in any projects, I'd love to hear any projects you've used it in. If you found this helpful, please do chuck in a like and subscribe, really does help out. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, I do have a Patreon and the link to that is in the description below. Bye!